On January 11th, 1987, a group of children playing in Daly City, California, came upon the body of a young woman concealed in the bushes in front of a residence. They alerted authorities, and the San Mateo County coroner and Daly City police soon determined that the woman had been slain recently, likely only hours before her discovery. The victim showed obvious signs of foul play, including trauma to her neck, indicating she had been strangled. Investigators noted that the remains bore no identification of any kind. This absence of personal items suggested she might have been living as a transient. A forensic autopsy was conducted to establish exactly how Jane Doe died and to gather clues about who she was. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of two antidepressant medications, imipramine and disapramine, in her system. These substances were not used recreationally, and the medical examiner found no evidence that she was a substance addict. Coupled with further injuries, including a cut lip and bruising on her face, authorities surmised that the overdose had been forced on her against her will. Beyond the COD, the coroner's examination provided a detailed physical description of the Jane Doe, which investigators hoped would match a missing person report. She was believed to be a white or possibly Hispanic female between 25 and 30 years old, standing around 5 feet 3 inches tall. Notably, she had extremely rough calluses on her hands, providing strong circumstantial evidence that she worked in a physical capacity. She was also generally noted to have an unkempt appearance, strongly indicating that she had fallen on hard times and lending more weight to the theory that she was a transient. Further, and perhaps most importantly, the coroner was able to determine that she had given birth at least once in her life. At the crime scene, investigators collected numerous pieces of evidence from the victim's body and the surrounding area. These items were documented in hopes they might provide leads to her identity or the circumstances of the crime. The victim was dressed in multiple layers of clothing, likely due to lack of shelter and a safe storage spot. For example, on her upper body she wore a jacket, a lavender sweatshirt with a hood, a pullover sweater, and a blue shirt. Near the body, police found a pill container bearing the name of a pharmacy located in Concord, California. The bottle's label was partially illegible, and it was empty, though investigators have strong reason to believe it was related to the act. Its presence was a puzzling clue, as Concord is a city about 40 miles away. It suggested the victim or the perpetrator likely had some connection to that area, since the prescription pills used aren't ones that had any meaningful street value. Investigators recognized a matchbook from Vern's Diner, a local restaurant in Daly City. This indicated the woman had recently visited or passed through that diner, but we'll come back to this in a moment. Fingerprint impressions were successfully lifted from the victim and submitted to law enforcement databases across the country. However, the fingerprint search received no hits, indicating that she had likely never been arrested previously. The victim's dental characteristics were recorded as well, and quick-thinking investigators were careful to preserve her DNA profile. While DNA analysis wasn't available in 1987, her DNA profile was later put into a national database, though again this yielded no results. Detectives also attempted to reconstruct the victim's last known activities. Following the clue of the Vern's Diner matchbook, detectives canvassed that area for witnesses. These inquiries produced a few promising leads. It was reported that earlier on the day of the slayings, a woman matching Jane Doe's description had been making a purchase at the restaurant. Also, when I was searching up Vern's Diner, it looks like it was a real fixture in the community for a number of years. I'm basing this on the number of Facebook posts I was able to find, saying something along the lines of, "You're not really from Daly City if you didn't go to Vern's back in the day." Around that same time, some people across the street were holding a garage sale. They recalled seeing what appeared to be the young woman in an argument with an unidentified man not far from the diner. They saw the two involved in some kind of altercation, but did not intervene, and unfortunately, they didn't know either individual. By the time police followed up, no one in the neighborhood recognized the description of the woman or could provide her name. The man seen arguing with her was never located. This was a frustrating dead end, although it strongly indicated that the victim had encountered foul play from that unknown male. It provided no names or motives. With no identification and no obvious suspect, the case faced challenges. However, the unusual nature of the crime, a combination of poisoning and strangulation, led to speculation that this might not have been an isolated incident. The method of slaying suggested a degree of planning and cruelty that could point to a serial offender. Over the years, investigators and crime analysts discussed the possibility that the perpetrator might have struck before or would strike again. A significant development in the case came over 2 decades later, in 2011. That year, authorities re-examined the evidence due to a potential link with a known serial offender. Joseph Nasso, a former resident of the Bay Area, had been arrested in April 2011 and charged with the slayings of several women. Nasso was an older man who, it turned out, had committed a string of slayings between the late 1970s to the mid-1990s, targeting women in California. His known victims had all been strangled and their bodies dumped in remote areas. When Nasso's crimes came to light, detectives in Daly City noted similarities between his modus operandi and the Jane Doe case. Both involved a female victim in roughly the same age range, barehanded strangulation, and a Northern California setting. Although the Jane Doe's death involved the additional twist of a forced overdose, the investigators felt it was plausible Nasso could have been involved. Now, personally, I think the overdose element is really what sets this case apart. But one thing we have to remember is that we don't have all the evidence that the authorities do. For open investigations, the authorities theoretically only reveal information and evidence tactically, in a way that potentially leads towards resolution. As a result of this lead, the San Mateo County Jane Doe case saw a flurry of new forensic activity in 2011. Investigators decided to perform an exhumation of Jane Doe's remains to gather additional evidence. The hope was that modern forensic techniques might reveal DNA traces of the perpetrator. Any unknown DNA profile obtained would then be compared against known offenders. The results of this effort were never announced, which isn't to say that Nasso was ruled out, but rather it's possible that no additional evidence could be found. Ultimately, we don't know if there was no DNA recovered, or if the DNA recovered simply didn't match with Joseph Nasso. So this is yet another case where I really think that genetic genealogy holds the key to giving the San Mateo Jane Doe her identity back, as well as potentially catching the perp. According to my research, there's nothing to indicate that a forensic genetic genealogy company has been retained by the San Mateo Sheriff's Office at this point. As with any case that may be solved with genetic genealogy, a big part of why cases aren't sent for this service is due to lack of public awareness of the case. Between 1975 and 1989, 7 females ranging from an 11-year-old girl to a 50-year-old woman were slain within a 20-kilometer radius in Japan's Saga Prefecture. The perpetrator, never identified, became known as the Wednesday Strangler because 6 of the 7 victims disappeared on a Wednesday. Investigators noted other common patterns across the acts. All the disappearances occurred in the evening or at night, and the 5 of the victims for whom the cause of death could be analyzed were confirmed to have died by strangulation. Further yet, most victims showed signs of indecent assault, suggesting a motive for the perp. These similarities convinced police that the incidents were connected and the work of a serial predator operating in the rural Saga region. The series of attacks began in the mid-1970s and unfolded sporadically over 14 years. The first known victim was Tomiko Yamasaki, a 12-year-old girl who vanished from her home in Kitagata on August 27th, 1975. Tomiko was home alone that evening. A friend had visited and left around 7 p.m., after which the girl mysteriously disappeared. Her mother returned that night. The television was still on, and Tomiko's shoes were by the door, but the girl was gone. She remained missing for nearly 5 years, until June 27, 1980, when her skeletal remains were discovered hidden in a septic tank by the swimming pool of a local elementary school. Only days before Tomiko's body was found, police had made another gruesome discovery at the same school. On June 24, 1980, the decomposed body of 19-year-old Ritsuko Hayakutake was found in a septic tank at that same school. Ritsuko, a young local woman, had disappeared on April 12, 1980, under similar circumstances after spending the night home alone. In the weeks after Ritsuko's disappearance, her family received a taunting letter written in an old-fashioned Japanese script. One line read that their daughter, quote, "isn't coming back," and another read, quote, "I hope you suffer." Notably, these letters were never proven to be from anyone related to the case. They also got a series of phone calls from a young-sounding man who warned them not to publicize Ritsuko's case or cooperate further with authorities. The discovery of Ritsuko's body and then Tomiko's in the exact same location 3 days later made it clear the two cases were linked. The next victim was Chizuko Ikegami, a 27-year-old factory employee from Shiroishi. On October 7, 1981, a Wednesday, Chizuko left her garment factory job and never returned home. About 2 weeks later, her body was found in a vacant lot in a nearby city. She had been strangled with an electrical power cord that was still wrapped around her neck. Just 4 months after Chizuko's slaying, an even younger victim was claimed. On February 17, 1982, Kumi Nishiyama, an 11-year-old elementary school student, was walking home when she was abducted. She had parted ways with her friends only minutes before the kidnappers struck. Kumi's body was found the next morning, stuffed inside a bag and left in a grove of trees near her school. It was estimated she was slain within 10 minutes of being taken. Several witnesses later reported seeing a suspicious middle-aged man in a white car cruising around the area that day. This man had allegedly tried to lure a woman at a bus stop into his car. This woman refused and threatened to call police. He was also seen approaching groups of school children, with some children reporting that he was offering rides, and others saying that he wanted to show them pictures. In fact, on that same afternoon, a man in a white car briefly kidnapped another young girl, releasing her only when she began crying loudly. Witnesses provided police with a partial license plate number and a description of the vehicle and driver. Unsurprisingly, the vehicle was noted to be a white sedan, very strongly suggesting the same man was responsible. Despite these leads, the man in the white car was never identified. After 1982, the perpetrator again went dormant for several years. Also, you may be wondering right now how the authorities still believe these cases are all related, but I'll be getting to that shortly. And to tip my hand more than a little bit, I'm in the camp that this was definitely carried out by multiple unrelated perpetrators, and you're about to see why. The case had grown cold when 5 years later, the violence began anew. On July 8, 1987, Sumiko Fujise, a 48-year-old restaurant worker from Takeo, left work early to go out with colleagues. After an hour together, her friends invited Sumiko to continue hanging out, but she declined and headed off on her own. Sumiko never made it home that night and was soon reported missing. About a year and a half later, on December 7, 1988, Kiyomi Nakajima, a 50-year-old housewife from Kitagata, also vanished under mysterious circumstances. Kiyomi had left her house that evening to attend a weekly volleyball practice at a local sports center less than a mile away, but she never arrived. A local resident had seen her speaking with a man on a bicycle shortly before she disappeared. 2 weeks into the search for Kiyomi, her husband received a strange phone call at home. An unidentified man claimed that Kiyomi had been found near a mountain pass. The caller hinted that he was someone the family knew, but he refused to give his name or specific details of Kiyomi's whereabouts. Kiyomi's husband recorded the strange phone message, but police were ultimately unable to trace the caller. Both Kiyomi's home and her husband's workplace began receiving repeated silent calls afterward, possibly from the same person. The final victim in this series was Tatsuyo Tatsu, a 37-year-old office worker from Kitagata. On January 25, 1989, again a Wednesday, Tatsuyo spoke with someone on the phone in the early evening, then told her mother she was going out to help a friend. She left the house and never returned. Later that same night, Tatsuyo's car was found abandoned in the parking lot of a local bowling alley. A co-worker came forward to report that she had seen Tatsuyo getting into a white Toyota sedan with an unknown person that evening. This disappearance immediately set off an intensive search, but it ended in grim fashion just 2 days later, and the results would spark a massive media firestorm. On January 27, 1989, a couple driving through a wooded area in the mountains of Kitagata pulled over so the wife could gather flowers. As she walked near the base of a cliff, she stumbled upon the dead body of a woman and immediately called police. When authorities arrived and searched the area, they discovered 2 more female bodies sprawled at the bottom of the same rocky slope, about 6 feet apart from each other. Personal items and clothing belonging to the victims were found scattered in the underbrush over the area, suggesting the perp had dumped the victims and their belongings from atop the cliff. The 3 bodies were soon identified as those of Sumiko Fujise, Kiyomi Nakajima, and Tatsuyo Yoshino, the missing women from 1987 to 1989. Forensic examination determined that Kiyomi and Tatsuyo had each been strangled, while Sumiko's remains were skeletal and the cause couldn't be made out. This finding sparked a massive media sensation and also marked the end of the slayings. The discovery of 3 bodies together in January 1989 dramatically re-energized the investigation. Given that Sumiko, Kiyomi, and Tatsuyo were all dumped at the same site, police now had confirmation that a single perpetrator was behind those 3 acts. Attention quickly turned to Teruhiko Matsue, a 26-year-old man from Kitagata, who had known Tatsuyo personally. Matsue was acquainted with Tatsuyo through work and was one of the last people to call her before she disappeared. In fact, immediately after the 1989 cliffside discoveries, Matsue was briefly detained and questioned because of his link to Tatsuyo. During an intensive interrogation, he seemed to suggest his involvement. However, he quickly recanted anything that could be taken as a confession, claiming he had been coerced, and he provided an alibi. He said that he was out with friends on the night Tatsuyo was slain. At that time, with no physical evidence or eyewitness testimony implicating him, the police let him go free. For more than a decade after 1989, the Wednesday Strangler case saw little progress. It wasn't until the early 2000s that investigators revisited Teruhiko Matsue as a suspect for the 1987 to 1989 triple slayings only. By 2002, Matsue was serving a short prison sentence for an unrelated burglary conviction, when new evidence and the looming expiration of the statute of limitations prompted police to act. On June 11, 2002, Saga Prefectural Police rearrested Teruhiko Matsue in his cell and formally charged him with 3 of the serial slayings. Notably, the 15-year statute of limitations had already expired on the first 4 slayings. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, portraying Matsue as a cold-blooded serial strangler who preyed on women and dumped their bodies in the mountains. Matsui's trial opened in October 2002 in Saga District Court, and he pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case against him was largely circumstantial. The prosecution's evidence included his past alleged confession and some potential forensic traces. Matsue's defense argued that the incriminating statements he gave were coerced by an aggressive police interrogation and that the DNA evidence wasn't conclusive. In fact, when a further mitochondrial DNA test was conducted on materials from the crime scene, the results didn't link Matsue at all, which was highly problematic to the case against him. Also, I feel it necessary to mention that this sort of evidence should have been considered a good thing for the prosecution. It let them know that they didn't have their man, but perhaps because the statute of limitations had expired, they just kept up the prosecution despite obvious exculpatory evidence. Ultimately, in 2005, after significant delays, the court found the case against Matsue lacking, and all charges against him were dismissed. The court wasn't kind to how investigators handled the case, to put it mildly. The court found that he had been coerced into his pseudo-confession. Also, given the way Japanese cops handle interrogations, when a Japanese court finds that an accused was coerced, that's pretty damning. This verdict was a shocking disappointment for the police and prosecutors, who immediately appealed. The saga finally came to a close in March 2007. The Fukuoka High Court upheld the not guilty verdict on appeal, meaning he was once again cleared of all charges. In its ruling, the High Court agreed that there was no direct evidence tying Matsue to the crimes, and it criticized the investigation's sloppy methods. To date, all 7 slayings remain officially unsolved. By the time Matsue was cleared, the statute of limitations for all cases had expired. Notably, in 2010, partly spurred by cases like this, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for serious offenses, but that change was not retroactive. Even if the Wednesday Strangler was to go public today, there would be nothing to do. Over the years, the Wednesday Strangler case has prompted extensive media coverage and countless theories. Some observers have argued that multiple perpetrators could have been responsible for these 7 slayings. They point out that the victims didn't all fit one profile. 2 of the victims were just 11 and 12. 2 of the other victims were women in their very early adulthood. The last 3 victims, spanning from 1987 to 1989, on the other hand, were middle-aged women. Serial predators often prefer a specific victim type or age range, which raises the possibility that the acts were committed by at least 2 different criminals operating at different times. This theory generally suggests that 3 or more perpetrators were involved, and that most of the links are simple coincidences. That said, there are still many who believe that given all these coincidences, this was all the work of one man. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that DNA evidence was preserved from the earlier victims, and unless the perpetrator comes out and confesses, it seems unlikely we'll ever have answers. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. On the evening of January 29, 1988, 16-year-old Spring Miller was struck in a deliberate hit-and-run attack in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Unfortunately, she didn't make it through, and the act sounds more like something out of a horror movie than real life. Spring and her 14-year-old sister, April, were walking near their neighborhood when they approached the driveway of an apartment complex. A black and white pickup truck waited at the lot entrance, and the girls paused to let it exit. The driver motioned for them to go ahead, but as the sisters crossed in front of the truck, he suddenly accelerated and struck them. April later recounted that the driver grinned before speeding forward, running over both girls. April's legs were run over, causing injuries from which she eventually recovered, but Spring was caught under the wheels. Sadly, both the front and back tires rolled over Spring's head. Despite bystanders rushing to help, Spring Miller died shortly after the attack. Albuquerque police immediately launched an investigation. Initial findings were based largely on eyewitness accounts, since the perpetrator fled the scene. Another potential witness, a woman driving a car directly behind the truck, was seen observing the incident. April tried desperately to flag this woman down for help, but disturbingly, the female driver refused to get involved and drove away. Police appealed for this unknown witness to come forward, but she was never located. Investigators canvassed the area and collected any physical evidence available. Tire marks and debris at the scene were documented, and police theorized early on that the hit and run was intentional rather than an accident, given the manner of the attack. A police sketch of the suspect was created based on April's recollection. And yes, if you're one of those people who just listens, this is your time to look at the police sketch. Personally, I find the appearance of this perpetrator incredibly unsettling. In the initial months, leads were scarce, given the assailant had used his vehicle as the weapon and quickly fled, leaving little forensic evidence behind. Spring Miller's slaying didn't occur in isolation. In fact, it fit a disturbing pattern of hit-and-run attacks targeting women on foot in Albuquerque in 1987 and 1988. Investigators noted striking similarities between Spring's case and other unresolved incidents in the area, suggesting a single perpetrator might be responsible. In September 1987, 47-year-old Nancy Weiss, a local school teacher, was out for an early morning jog when she noticed an unfamiliar white pickup truck passing her repeatedly. Without warning, the driver struck her from behind. Weiss was knocked unconscious and later found, badly injured, at a different location. Some theorized that the attacker had moved her, possibly believing she was dead. Others theorized that due to the head injury she sustained, she may have wandered to a new location in a dissociative state before regaining full consciousness. Miraculously, Nancy Weiss survived the attack. Police later found that the truck used in the attack had been stolen, as it was later found abandoned in a nearby creek bed. Given her head injury and hazy memory of the incident, Nancy couldn't provide many further details. 2 months later, on November 11th, 1987, 38-year-old Elaine Dybel was jogging along Tramway Boulevard in Albuquerque when she was run down. Unfortunately, she didn't make it, perishing at the scene from her injuries. The attack on the Miller sisters in January 1988 sadly wouldn't be the last attack. On July 19, 1988, the pattern of attacks culminated in another incident, one that would finally give police a solid suspect. That morning, a man in a maroon sedan, later determined to be stolen, targeted 2 young women out jogging in Albuquerque. The first, Mary Beth Matthews, was confronted by a driver who tried to hit her with the car, swerving toward her and seemingly toying with her before she escaped unharmed. Just hours later, 23-year-old Monica Robles was jogging in the same area when a similar maroon car began following and harassing her. The driver repeatedly pulled ahead of Robles, turned, and drove past her multiple times, behavior eerily reminiscent of what Nancy Weiss had described in her attack. Sensing danger, Robles tried to get away, but the driver eventually accelerated and struck her from behind, throwing her into a yard. Monica Robles survived the hit, although she was injured and traumatized. Crucially, a neighbor witnessed part of the assault and managed to take down the car's license plate number as the assailant fled the scene. Robles herself got a look at the driver and later said he watched her for some time before speeding off, apparently to see if she was going to make it or not. When police traced the license plate, they discovered the car had been reported stolen earlier that day. However, armed with the plate information and Monica's description, officers quickly located and arrested 22-year-old Christopher Martinez in connection with the attack. Martinez, who lived in Albuquerque and had a prior criminal record for burglary, was charged with multiple felonies. At last, investigators had a name and face that might match the elusive hit-and-run perpetrator. Notably, he had a habit of stealing vehicles and had stolen pickup trucks previously. These parallels immediately put Martinez at the top of the suspect list for the hit-and-run attacks. Martinez denied involvement in the previous hit-and-run attacks, and ultimately, prosecutors didn't have enough to charge him. Nonetheless, Martinez did face justice for the attack on Monica Robles and the attempted assault on Mary Beth Matthews. In November 1988, he pleaded guilty to aggravated battery and other charges related to the July attack and was given an 8-year sentence. Notably, another hit-and-run occurred in Albuquerque in September 1988, while Martinez was already behind bars. This has led some to believe that Martinez wasn't the true perpetrator, and that the actual person responsible likely stopped when he heard about Martinez. Under this theory, the actual perpetrator may have stopped the attacks when he found out the authorities believed they had their man, but didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him. Another theory suggests that all the attacks were independent and unrelated events, with the exception of the 2 July attacks, which were done by Martinez. Personally, I don't see much of a resemblance between the police sketch of Martinez and the man who attacked the Miller sisters. That said, that sketch was derived from a very brief sighting by April Miller after she had just gone through an extremely traumatic incident. The Ship of Theseus paradox dates back to ancient Greece and was first recorded by the historian Plutarch in the 1st century AD. It centers on the legendary ship that carried the hero Theseus home to Athens after he defeated the Minotaur in Crete. According to Plutarch's account, the Athenians preserved Theseus's ship as a treasured relic by gradually replacing its wooden planks as they decayed. Over time, every original piece of wood was replaced with new timber, yet the vessel was still referred to as the Ship of Theseus. This gave rise to a philosophical question that would echo through history. After all its components have been replaced one by one, is it still the same ship? Philosophers took the ship as an example of the problem of identity within change, with some arguing it remained the same ship and others insisting it was a different vessel. At its core, the Ship of Theseus poses a deceptively simple riddle. If you replace every part of an object, one after another, do you still have the original object in the end? Over the centuries, this thought experiment has been retold in various forms and has been applied to everything from George Washington's axe to numerous bands who lost all original members. A classic variant was suggested by the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who gave the puzzle an extra twist. Hobbes imagined that someone saved all the old planks as they were removed from Theseus's ship, then used those discarded parts to build a second ship. Now there are 2 ships, the continuously maintained ship made of new planks, and another ship reassembled from all the original pieces. The question becomes even trickier. Which one, if either, is the real Ship of Theseus? This variation highlights a conflict in logic. It seems impossible for both to be the same original ship without defying the basic rules of identity. The Ship of Theseus isn't just a clever puzzle. It strikes at the heart of philosophical debates about identity. One classical perspective comes from Aristotle's philosophy, using the idea of form and matter. According to Aristotle, any object can be described by its form, the design or essence of the thing, and its matter, the material it's made of. In the case of Theseus's ship, the form, its design, structure, and purpose, remained constant, even as the wooden planks were swapped out. The matter, the particular pieces of wood, changed over the years, but the overall shape and function of the vessel did not. By Aristotle's reasoning, the ship could be considered the same in identity because its formal cause, design, and purpose stayed the same. The ship still looked and functioned as Theseus's ship, fulfilling the same role, despite the new lumber. This line of thought suggests that an object's essence or pattern is what truly defines it, not the specific atoms that come and go. Other philosophers focus on the concept of continuity. They argue that identity is preserved through the continuous history or function of an object rather than its original components. For instance, those who sailed on Theseus's ship year after year could claim it's obviously the same vessel they've been aboard all along. The ship maintained an unbroken existence and use, so we naturally call it the same ship by convention. In contrast, a ship rebuilt in the museum from original planks might be seen as a replica or a restoration if the other ship sailed on, because it didn't carry forward the original ship's journey. This solution has an inherent problem, though. It creates the issue where if the replacement sails on, the original lumber ship is a replica, where if it doesn't sail on, the museum ship is the original. The ship reconstructed in a museum thus has its identity defined entirely by the function of a replacement ship. Some thinkers have concluded that the puzzle reveals a problem in our definitions, rather than in the objects themselves. They distinguish between qualitative identity, having the same properties or appearance, and numerical identity, being one and the same entity. By the end of the repairs, the ship at sea is qualitatively identical to the original. It looks and functions like the original ship, but not made of the same matter. It is not numerically identical in the strict sense of the very same object, because none of the original wood remains. In everyday life, however, we often care more about an object's continuity and qualities than its absolute material sameness. This is why calling a ship made from replacement parts is practical in everyday life, even if philosophically contentious. Modern philosophy has developed more abstract solutions as well. One radical view is compositional nihilism, which suggests that composite objects don't truly exist as single entities at all. Only their fundamental parts exist. By this view, asking if the ship is the same is a mistake, because there really is no ship, only a collection of planks arranged into the shape associated with a ship. This perspective states that only the planks, or the microscopic particles, are real, and the ship itself is just a convenient idea, essentially an illusion or a construct. At the opposite end, there are theories of four-dimensionalism, which propose that an object is not a static three-dimensional thing, but a four-dimensional entity extended in time. Under this theory, the ship is more like a long worm stretched through the fourth dimension of time. In this view, the ship of Theseus can be thought of as a series of temporal parts, a continuum of ship stages from the day it was first built to the day its last original plank was removed. All those stages together constitute the whole identity of the ship. Philosophers who favor this approach would say the ship persists as a single four-dimensional object, and each version of the ship is just a time-bound segment of that larger whole. This can be a mind-bending idea. It allows us to say the ship is and isn't the same in different senses. It's part of one continuous space-time object, yet any two time-based slices of it are not made of the same stuff, so to speak. While no consensus exists amongst philosophers, I tend to prefer this view as it appears to meaningfully resolve the paradox. That said, I know someone in the comments will say something about Wittgenstein and just totally light me up. So do your worst. I'm here for it. In the summer of 1907, Dublin Castle became the center of a mystery that still fascinates historians. The Irish crown jewels, a set of jeweled regalia belonging to the Order of St. Patrick, vanished from a secure safe within the castle walls. The theft was discovered just days before a planned royal visit, causing a scandal that shook the British administration in Ireland. On the morning of July 6, 1907, a cleaning woman arrived for her routine duties at Bedford Tower in Dublin Castle and found something amiss. The door to the strong room where the jewels safe was kept stood wide open, with a key still dangling in the lock. The inner security door was bolted, so at first nothing seemed obviously stolen. Sir Arthur Vickers, the official custodian of the jewels, was initially unconcerned and went about his day. It was only later that afternoon, when a messenger was sent to store a knight's ceremonial collar in the safe, that the grim truth was revealed. The safe had been emptied and the Irish crown jewels were gone. The alarm spread quickly. The jewels had disappeared just 4 days before King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were due in Dublin for a state visit. A special investiture ceremony was to take place at the Irish International Exhibition, where the king planned to use the jewels to induct a new member of the Order of St. Patrick. With the regalia missing, the ceremony had to be cancelled. King Edward was reportedly furious about the theft, and the incident proved to be a major embarrassment for the Irish authorities. The Dublin Metropolitan Police launched an immediate investigation, and even a detective from London's Scotland Yard, Chief Inspector John Kane, was called in to assist. Investigators found no signs of forced entry on the doors or the safe, indicating that whoever stole the jewels had used the actual keys or precise copies. From the very start, suspicion focused on an inside job. Evidence from the crime scene reinforced the idea that the thief was someone with intimate access and patience. Inside the safe, the perpetrators had shown meticulous care. For example, a sky blue ribbon that had been attached to one of the jeweled badges was carefully unscrewed and left behind in its box. This is a task that would have taken several minutes, and the authorities speculated an outsider would have ripped it off in a hurry. Likewise, the tissue and cloth in the storage boxes were neatly refolded after the jewels were removed. This was no smash-and-grab robbery. It appeared the thief had ample time and no fear of interruption. The careful method of the theft, combined with the lack of forced entry, made it clear the culprit likely had authorized access to keys and inside knowledge of the castle's security routines. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to those who had custody or access to the safe. The foremost figure was Sir Arthur Vickers, Ulster King of Arms, whose prestigious office included the duty of guarding the jeweled insignia. Vickers was responsible for the keys. He usually kept one of the two safe keys on his person and stored the other at his home in a locked drawer. In the wake of the theft, Vickers became one of the first suspects, simply due to his role and a series of security lapses on his watch. It emerged that Vickers had been alarmingly lax in safeguarding the jewels. On one occasion, he had drunkenly allowed friends to handle the keys, even waking up after a party to find himself draped in the priceless jewels as a prank. Personally, I speculate that this may have been a dry run for the jewel heist, and also perhaps one of the world's first documented uses of the "it's just a prank, bro" excuse. But this wasn't the only negligent thing Vickers had done. Far from it. Just weeks before the heist, he had mistakenly left the safe's key on a key ring with other office keys, which one of the servants then found and returned. Such stories cast Vickers as a negligent buffoon at best. Vickers, however, vehemently denied any involvement in the theft. He insisted he was being made a scapegoat and maintained his innocence to his dying day. Despite the lack of hard evidence tying him to the crime, Vickers faced severe consequences, and King Edward demanded his resignation. A secretive vice-regal commission later found Vickers guilty of negligence in his duties, but stopped short of finding that he was in on it. This effectively ended his career and tarnished his reputation. Another figure under scrutiny was Pierce Mahoney, an Office of Arms employee who was Vickers' nephew and assistant. Mahoney had access to the Office of Arms and was familiar with the castle's operations. He was questioned as a possible accomplice or culprit. However, most contemporaries and later historians believe Mahoney was innocent. He had no clear motive to steal the jewels and was known to be loyal to Vickers. Suspicion soon concentrated on Francis Shackleton, a charismatic man who was Vickers' second-in-command at Dublin Castle. Francis Shackleton was the younger brother of the famous Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, which gave the case an added dose of public intrigue. Unlike his explorer brother, Francis sought his fortunes in high society circles. And let's just say that Shackleton was known to get around these circles and was particularly interested in becoming very closely acquainted with wealthy and powerful men. Vickers had appointed Shackleton to the honorary position of Dublin Herald in the Office of Arms in 1905, which, while unpaid, gave him status and access to Dublin Castle. Shackleton was often a house guest of Vickers, even sharing Vickers' residence during stays in Dublin. This close relationship meant Shackleton could potentially get hold of Vickers' keys without raising suspicion. Moreover, investigators uncovered that Shackleton was in dire financial straits by 1907. He had been involved in speculative ventures that failed, and his debts were mounting, a strong possible motive for a theft of valuable jewels. All these factors made Francis Shackleton a prime suspect in the eyes of many. Indeed, Vickers himself later accused Shackleton of betrayal, and numerous people at the time believed Shackleton was the true culprit behind the heist. One theory, reported years later, suggested that Shackleton, together with his close friend Captain Richard Gorges, had capitalized on Vickers' lax security. According to this account, one night after Vickers had drunk himself into a stupor, Shackleton and Gorges supposedly lifted the keys from the sleeping Vickers. They entered the library safe, removed the jewels, then returned everything, keys and doors, to normal, so no immediate suspicion would arise. This clever ruse would mean the theft wasn't discovered until weeks later, giving the thieves a long head start. However, despite these suspicions and rumors, Francis Shackleton was never formally charged. In the official investigation, he maintained an alibi. Conveniently, he had left Ireland for London on June 11, 1907, and did not return until after the jewels were reported missing. This alibi didn't entirely clear him for two simple reasons. It's never been entirely clear when the Irish crown jewels were actually stolen, and he may have had an accomplice such as Gorges do the deed. Some have speculated that investigators were reluctant to prosecute Shackleton for fear he might expose scandalous information about others in high society if cornered. Francis Shackleton was known to get around high society circles, and let's just say a lot of influential men may not like what he had to say about their late-night activities. Shackleton's later life did little to dispel doubts about his character. A few years after the jewel affair, he was convicted of fraud for unrelated financial crimes in 1913 and spent time in prison. He had even fled the UK to Portuguese East Africa for a time, where he attempted to work in the colonial administration and later found work on a plantation. Upon release, he changed his name and lived quietly abroad, dying in obscurity many years later, having never admitted any role in the Dublin Castle heist. A final suspect emerged long after the initial investigation: Francis Bennett Goldney. Goldney was an Englishman who had been appointed to a minor post at Dublin Castle just months before the jewels vanished. At the time of the theft, Goldney attracted little suspicion as he was seen as a wealthy, respectable gentleman with no obvious motive. And yes, you heard me correctly, he wasn't investigated because he was already seen as rich enough, as if being wealthy had ever stopped someone from accumulating more wealth. It was only in 1918, when Goldney died in a car accident in France, that his reputation darkened. After his death, authorities discovered a trove of stolen historical items hidden in his home, revealing that Goldney had been secretly stealing valuable artifacts. This shocking discovery led some to retroactively suspect Goldney in the Irish crown jewels case. If he was willing to steal manuscripts and artworks, perhaps he also stole the jewels. Investigators never found any direct evidence linking Goldney to the 1907 heist, but his later infamy as a thief added another tantalizing theory to the saga. Notably, some have suggested that there was a curse on the Irish crown jewels. Vickers was executed in 1921 during the Irish War of Independence on suspicion that he was a British sympathizer. Francis Shackleton's life spiraled down after 1907. By 1910, he was bankrupt, and in the years that followed, he was convicted for multiple fraudulent schemes, including swindling a longtime friend out of a fortune. Despite being from a wealthy and famous family, he died in relative poverty, living under an assumed name. Captain Richard Gorges, who had been whispered about as Shackleton's accomplice, likewise led a troubled life. He was involved in a violent incident with the police in which he ended up slaying an officer. Due to some complicating circumstances, he was only sentenced to 12 years in prison. While in prison, Gorges allegedly tried to bargain for leniency by offering information about the crown jewels, but authorities did not deem his claims credible. Gorges was later prosecuted for minor offenses, including shoplifting and passing bad checks. In 1944, he was struck by a train in London, ending the tale of Captain Richard Gorges once and for all. Potentially for reasons of propriety and saving face for a wealthy family of the landed gentry, his death seems to have been ruled accidental, but you can apply your own judgment. Pierce Mahoney, Vickers' loyal assistant, withdrew from public life in 1914. He was found dead by an accidental shot in a boating incident, a mysterious end that some have wondered about. As for Francis Bennett Goldney, he continued a respectable public career, even becoming a member of Parliament, until his car accident in 1918. Despite intensive investigations and worldwide attention, the Irish crown jewels have never been recovered. Notably, the jewels weren't inherently incredibly valuable at the time. It was their status as the Irish crown jewels and the historical value of the jewels that made them just so priceless. Modern theorists speculate that for this reason, it's unlikely that the goods were broken up, anonymized, and sold separately.